Hello, everybody. This is Sean Williams at Campbellsville University. As you know, if you watched any of our previous broadcasts, I'm the lead professor of political science. And once again, we're joining you with another one of our series of discussions from our senior seminar class. This week, we're going to be discussing the Venezuelan economic and humanitarian crisis. A wide-ranging discussion, which we're hoping will focus on everything from what's causing the economic crisis to some of the solutions to the economic crisis, and ultimately, hopefully, the students will have some solutions themselves. Joining me today on the broadcast, we have three of our panelists. Two are returning from last week. From my right to my left, we have JD, who is joining us, and also Oksana Marquez. And then two more new students to the program. We have Eli Wood. You may have seen in some of our previous broadcasts, specifically from the Iowa caucuses. And then the only rookie on the panel today, Rachel Wolf. How are you guys doing tonight?
Great.
Great.
Fantastic. So let's go ahead and get started. So first of all, whoever wants to jump in, kind of explain to the viewers who may not be as familiar with it, what exactly is happening in Venezuela right now? Why is this the subject of conversation today?
Well, I'll start it off. Well, Venezuela is going through a crisis right now, dealing with their economy crashing due to when their former president, who passed away, Chavez, who helped the country reach all-time high with their oil prices. Venezuela is very big in the oil export. Literally put all the marbles inside of the oil industry. And basically you're seeing just a huge crash in the economy from him just putting all the oil industry and then this all coming down to an end at one time. And so now you're just seeing all his social policies and things that he put in contact based off the income that he had and generated from the oil just basically all coming down at one time now. And now you see a huge crisis and strikes and people revolting, trying to get resources and money all at one time.
So that's a pretty good description of the causes. What are some of the symptoms? What are the things that people who are in the country right now experiencing for themselves?
Well, you have all right, go ahead.
Rachel.
Sorry. I just was going to say that I actually know someone from Venezuela, and I know that it's really dire down there. They can't even get basic goods off the shelves. Like, it's so expensive. I've heard that people are like dying in the streets. And so from a humanitarian angle, it's just, it's really, really bad. Like, people can't leave the country as freely. They can't, they don't have many opportunities to escape. And then they can't buy even like the most basic goods and food on the shelves.
Yeah, not only are the goods hyperinflated as far as price, they also aren't really there to get in the first place, and that's caused, I think, a lot of despair and a lot of riots and just extreme poverty. And you see it all the time, just people out in the street, and I mean, there's really nothing left for them to do except for try to survive.
And the latest statistics have the numbers at, I think, around 2.3 million people have fled the country, either going somewhere around there in South America or some even as far as the United States, some even back to Spain. So a lot of people are trying to get out of there.
Right. And to add to that stat line, I think when I was doing some research and watching some documentaries, I think the country's in like $150 billion worth of debt right now. And they're only generating, I believe, somewhere from $5 to $6 billion from their exports. So, I mean, they're in a huge debt from borrowing from so many of these other countries that all the social programs that Chavez has made, came up with, they're starting to take a huge crush because, I mean, other countries and other people who are lending out the money are starting to realize that the oil prices, which were at one point outrageously high, and they made all their money, are starting to drastically drop, and so they're starting to lose all their revenue. Because I believe that I think it's either 95 or 96 somewhere, 95% of their income came from oil, and they're starting to literally lose all of it.
If you guys were to describe their economic system, how would you describe the economic system to an outsider? Is it more like the Americans? Is it less like the American? More like the Chinese? How would you describe it?
They consider themselves like entitled as a socialist regime, and that's because they do a lot of redistribution of wealth system. I mean, the current president Maduro is a huge like fan of the poor people. That's like his thing. He appeals to the poor people by using money and giving it out to the poor. And that's one of the reasons they have such a bad hyperinflation rate, is because he's just giving out money to people when there's nothing, like there's no reason, there's no, I guess, resources for that money to be given out for. And so I think the latest numbers as of July had the annual inflation rate is 2,000%, which is astounding.
Eli, both you and Jordan, you made a similar argument in your discussion. Both of you seem to suggest that the practice of giving money away, that the social programs that are being created, poverty alleviation, other forms of socialist programs, that there's somehow an underlying cause. Is that a fair statement? Do you think it's overstated?
Well, I think that is fair. I don't think that they really took into consideration when they were making all this money from oil. What's going to happen when the oil prices drop? I mean, because the oil industry, I mean, if you know anything about business, it goes up and down depending on how much people need it, how much is being used, the price of it goes up and down. In the time that it was up, they literally put all their marbles into it. Now they're starting to see this domino effect from all these social programs that they created, you know, like healthcare, food organizations, giving scholarships to people, college. They're starting to see it all fall down because literally they put all their money inside of oil to generate that revenue to keep these social programs going. Now that they don't have that revenue anymore, these social programs are starting to fall. And this where you see people who are, you know, starving. People are not getting educated, and you just see people, I mean, they can't get food, so they're starting to riot, and the value of the money is starting to decrease as well.
If that's the case, if the problem is the fluctuation of oil prices, is it socialism or is it oil prices? Is that the most important economic characteristic? Is it dependence on a single commodity, or is it the giving away of the money?
Personally, I would argue that it's dependence on a single commodity.
Right.
Like Jordan said, such a high percentage of their GDP came from oil, and so that's all they depended on. And then when oil was good, they would spend, and not invest in anything else.
Right.
And then when oil got bad, like it did at the end of 2013, when the price per barrel started going down and they didn't want to just give it away, they had nothing left to do. And so, yeah, the social programs might extract a little bit of money or a lot of money, but that doesn't really matter when the price, like when the weight of currency is so low. Like, so they can be giving away money, but it's basically just them giving strips of paper because the currency is meaningless at this point.
All right.
That's a little bit about the economics, and we're certainly going to come back to that later. What about the political system? Is Venezuela a democratic system? Is it an authoritarian regime? What are some of the basic characteristics of its politics?
It's mass.
Okay,
sorry.
No, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Rachel.
I was going to say, I just that it wasn't dictatorial. But I couldn't like I found an article claiming that the elections actually have been like fair, but I couldn't really, like, it kind of just seemed like different people were claiming different things. But I did read that like the government just everyone like, oh gosh, I lost my train of thought. I read that like Chavez and the new one, like they don't have a lot of the support of the people, but their opposition doesn't either. And then mainly the main thing that I kept seeing come up about the government wasn't exactly what type it was, but just that it was extremely corrupt, and that the money that should be getting funneled towards the people was just lining the pockets. And so that's what mostly kept coming up whenever I tried to like read about their government.
Eli, is that kind of what you were going to add?
Yeah, I mean, my main point was that it's kind of being disguised as a democracy, but any research you do on the country will show that it's actually not a democracy. It's classified as one of the worst authoritarian regimes right now because you don't know what is exactly is happening in these elections. Like even if it says 63, Maduro just got elected in I think it was May of 2018, he got reelected, and they said it was 63% of the vote. But they also said that only like between 35 and 40% of the population actually went and voted. So, I mean, that's not even a fair statistic. And on top of that, that doesn't count for how many of those were changed via the government, how many of those were forced votes via military that was staged at voting booths. And so I think it's definitely, even though they will call themselves a democracy and say that people go out and vote for him, you have to take into account that, of course, any country is not going to sit there and admit that they forced their people to vote a certain way.
You know, when you're looking at 25% voter turnout, that's even worse than America. And that's bad. A lot of people have questioned the degree to which the government bears responsibility for the current crisis. Is the problem that the government has made the decision to invest all the money in oil? Is the problem that private enterprise hasn't been investing in money in anything other than oil development? Is it the problem that the voters were the ones who were responsible for voting this in, and it's really just the government? Like, what's the government's culpability here? Can we blame Maduro and Chavez, or is it something else?
I think that the biggest blame should go towards, you know, the government, and not necessarily Maduro, not necessarily him, because he's trying to overtake what Chavez did during his time in office, which is kind of not a fair thing to him, but it's just part of the new presidents come in. They're always, I mean, their first 2 years, they're always trying to cover up for what the last president did for 4 years or 8 years. But I think the biggest problem was that they literally put all their chips into the success of oil being so high and never invested any of that money. Like Oksana had mentioned earlier, they literally just were just throwing money because they were just making so much of it, and they weren't investing it and doing things smartly with the money, which, I mean, we're seeing now is causing them greatly, harming them.
I mean, it's also important to see that even though they were two different people, Chavez and Maduro was handpicked by Chavez to be his successor. He served on his cabinet as his Minister of Foreign Affairs. And so, like, they do have their differences, but they also are very similar. And some see Maduro as a continuation of the Chavez regime.
Oh, sorry. No, you go.
You're okay.
Ms. Marquez, go ahead.
I think, like Eli and Jordan have said, that the government chose where to spend all of their money, and it's, I think, in part the government's responsibility to make sure that the economy's head is above water, and they were reckless and careless in their spending and didn't care for, you know, the good of their people when they were doing so. And so I think that definitely the government is who is to blame for the current crisis.
Ms. Wolf?
Yeah, I mean, I basically agree with what Oksana said. I mean, yeah, you may have voted, the people may have voted the regime into office, but at the end of the day, a government's sole purpose is to govern the people. And if you're not doing anything to organize society and make sure it prospers, then you're not doing your job, and you are culpable for the downfall of it.
One of the arguments that was made first by Chavez and is now being reiterated by the Maduro government is that many of the problems that not just Venezuela, but that any Latin American country faces is the constant intervention from outside forces. What about that argument? Do you guys feel that other external forces, other countries are to blame, or is this entirely a domestic issue?
I believe that, I feel where other countries are coming from. I mean, literally, they saw the profits of the oil prices dropping, so literally everybody took whatever they could before they lost money. So I think it was more of a domestic problem because they literally didn't plan for a rainy day at all, obviously. So I mean, there was no extra money put up to invest in other things, like I've said constantly. And so I mean, other countries saw that, and all lenders and people who gave money to um, Chavez and Maduro. I mean, they started to realize. I mean, they weren't going to get any income or any get back from it. And most of the time, people help you, they're looking for something in return. And if they're not going to get anything in return. You start to see what's going on in Venezuela. People start to pull their chips out, and the country is starting to fold, literally.
I saw something about United States sanctions being imposed upon Venezuela, and I think the government does kind of want to cop out because obviously they know they're not popular there. But I do think there is something to be said that when like a country powerful like the United States imposes sanctions, other countries are going to pull out support, are not going to trade, like things like that. So I think that it definitely can cause issues for Venezuela, and it could be part of the problem.
The U.S. has tried for years. I mean, that's like since the end of World War II, and people consider the U.S. a superpower or whatever. They've tried to go impose democracy worldwide. That's one of their big things is democratization. But some other governments that they're interfering with see that as imperialism, and that's what Chavez and Maduro were always referring to the U.S. as an imperialist country. Going around imposing their ways on everybody else. And so you kind of have to think of it from their perspective also as another country coming in. And how are you going to view people, when they're just trying to impose their ways on you?
Well, it's not just since World War II. I mean, we know that, for example, during the George W. Bush regime, that the Bush administration actually helped to sponsor a coup against the Chavez government. Also, that there's recent evidence that suggests that not only has that happened, but since the beginning of the Trump administration, that the Trump regime has also had talks with potential supporters of coups in the area. If we're honest, wouldn't we say that we have at least some responsibility for the problems there? Oksana, what do you think?
I think if we do, it's very small. I mean, I'm not going to say that we helped the problem as much as we could have. And the sanctions, I do think, like, we obviously did those because we knew they would have an impact. But I still don't know if I believe that it's as big of a responsibility as compared to the government itself. Like, a speck in a pile of sand, I don't really think, can be accounted to that. But I think, like I said, we obviously knew what we were doing when we imposed the sanctions, and we knew who would follow, and we knew that that would have an adverse effect on the people we were trying to affect.
Something that JD had alerted to a little bit earlier, I wanted you guys to speak a little bit more about. JD, you had talked about money or resources being pulled out of Venezuela as American sanctions were beginning, or as oil prices were beginning to fall. Could you talk a little bit more about this idea of capital flight, currency flight? Has the government in Venezuela, and this is open to anybody, not just to Jordan, but has the government in Venezuela done anything to try to stop the flight of currency?
I mean, I didn't see anything. I didn't do any research, too much research on if they've done anything, but they definitely didn't offer any type of security to these countries that invested inside of them, inside of the oil and their resources. Literally, when things started to shrivel, they really had nothing to show for. All they had was just the revenue from the oil, which was like I said, like 96% of their economy and the revenue that they brought in. And so, other countries started to see that the oil prices were dropping. They started to pull out because there's no sense of security. Other countries also knew that this is their only revenue, and they were taking a huge loss if they just kept, you know, whatever profit or money that they put into the country, they knew that they would be taking a huge loss.
Anyone else want to tackle the currency exchange problem? I mean, what ultimately is the cause of the hyperinflation that they're experiencing right now?
I'm not sure if this is exactly the same as the currency exchange thing, but I do know that there was an issue talking about how they actually changed like what their currency is. Is that relevant to what we were talking? Okay, so it was called the Strong Bolivar before, and they changed the name of their currency to the Sovereign Bolivar. Obviously, it's translated, but they're just trying to, like, you know, change what their system is to make people feel this is new money. Like, that was old, this is new, this is going to work because we've changed the system. But actually, what it's done in turn is confused the people, because people have to go in once they figure out that their old money is no longer like used in the markets or anything, and you have to use new money. So you go in and trade that in, and you're confused about the whole system. You're like, okay, how do I trust you that I'm trading this, what was the old one, the Strong Bolivar, and I'm getting enough of the Sovereign Bolivar out of it? And so by changing their whole currency system, I mean, that just causes confusion to the people, which in turn could hurt the economy even worse, because then you have people who not only do they not have the money they need, they don't know how to spend the money that they do have.
I think another thing that really hurt the country as a whole.
Looks like we may have lost
the bank. Is everybody back?
Yeah, you're back.
Okay. He literally bought everything that the country was. I think the Bank of I can't remember the correct pronunciation of it, so I'm not even going to try to tackle it, but. The bank, I think it was the Bank of Venezuela. He bought all type of, you know, things that were generating revenue, and kind of like, you know, privatized it so that it was only ran by Venezuela and not by other countries that could bring possible revenue into it. So that I think that also took a huge hit and swing on the country as a whole, because when everything fell, everything that they had bought and everything that people had invested into was literally owned by the country, so they couldn't really reach back and, you know, depend on things, because they had literally private I can't think of the word, had literally, you know, just bought everything that they could when they were making money. So when it was gone, that was fell with it as well.
If I were to study a macroeconomics course, here's what they would say. They would tell me that as prices were going up, that people in the domestic marketplace would start producing more goods, that if you had a point where there wasn't enough food on the shelves, people would begin to produce more food. If there wasn't enough automobiles, companies would start producing more automobiles. Why isn't that happening? Why is the currency exchange revaluation not solving this problem? What's going on?
I don't know if this, I don't think this tackles the entire question, but what you were saying about like why are there not products on the shelves? I read that Chavez actually, in his attempts to help like the poor class, he like made minimums for what I think minimum, like a minimum wage kind of, for like things being manufactured in Venezuela, like how much you could charge for it and things of that nature, like things like toothpaste and stuff like that. Just basic goods. And because he made it that way where you had to make them a certain price, people stopped manufacturing because it was not, they weren't being able to cut a profit. And so everything that they need is imported. And the only thing that they export as of like the last 5 years, 96% was oil. So they don't have that ability to give it to people, even if they have the money, because they can't afford to import it.
I've got to admit, you guys, you're not making me feel particularly good about socialist economies. It seems that everywhere we turn, the decision to try to make wages fair for workers and to try to make sure that money is being distributed to poor people, it doesn't sound like that's a good formula. Is this a fair incrimination for all socialist countries?
I don't think so, because, oh, I'm so sorry. Oh my God.
Go ahead, Eli.
I don't think it is, just because I've thought about this, and like obviously there's issues in Venezuela, but I don't think that that matches up with the rest of the world, because when you look at like some Scandinavian countries or European countries, they're quite socialist, and they're ranked very high when it comes to GDP and even national happiness and things like that, and wealth. And so I don't think that you can just attribute it to a socialist government.
Yeah, and I think the biggest issue is you can't mix socialism and corruption. And those are two very prominent things in Venezuela. And so like she was saying, in Scandinavian countries and in Northern Europe, you can use that because corruption isn't such a big issue. So when you're giving more money to the government, expecting it to be redistributed equally, it will be, because the government has checks and balances and is responsible to its people. Whereas in Venezuela, they gave all the money to the government expecting to get some back, and there was corruption issues, and the money went to these rich people that already had enough money. So corruption and socialism cannot, no, can't mix them.
So corrupt capitalism bad, corrupt socialism even worse. Is that what you're saying?
A plus.
It's like that perfect middle ground that we will never get to in any country in the world.
You have also talked a little bit about, we had talked earlier about the idea of popular support for the regime. That apparently the elections, for the most part, have been going into favor of the Chavez and Maduro regime. Chavez had attempted a couple of constitutional reforms, which were voted down. But the electoral system suggests that there's popular support from the regime. Do we have reasons to believe that that's actual genuine broad-based support? Or does it appear that support for the system is eroding? And as a follow-up question, what I also want to understand is, if there is no support, why is the regime still in power? Why hasn't it been overthrown?
I don't remember which article it was, but I think it was the one you sent. And it said that 50% of people, like Eli said earlier, they're just not voting. So they don't have faith in the government as it is, but they also don't have faith in any opposition. So it's kind of like they have nowhere to go. Like the government, they don't support it. But because obviously they see what's going on in the streets, they see their own poverty. And so they're not going to support the government, but they also don't see a good, viable option, I think, is a big part of it.
I agree with Rachel, and like Eli talked about earlier, the voter turnout is so low, so I don't think you can say that there's a wide base, support for the government. And also, like was pointed out, we can't necessarily go off that because we don't see the behind the scenes of the elections and the polls and where the votes go. And in an interview, the current president, he was asked a question, I don't remember the question, but kind of to denounce everything. He was like, tell me a country who's had more elections than we've had the past so many years. We're such a democracy. And it's like, yeah, you can call yourself a democracy because you vote, but also, like, how many votes have you changed? How many votes have you flipped? And when a country's so in despair, at the beginning, I don't think that they realized what they were walking into, but now they do. I mean, I'm sorry, but if I'm fighting for my life and, fighting to stay alive, how can you truly expect me to also be trying to fight and change a government that's trying to kill me?
Right. And I think another problem is that, the country at one point in time, they put so much faith into, Chavez and Maduro. And, at first they were successful, and now they're starting to fall apart. And that now they're kind of using that as, as bait and selling them false hope, trying to make new currency and make them think, that things are getting better or that this is going to improve the situation, when honestly they know that it's really not, and it's really a big gamble. But, they're kind of selling the people of Venezuela, false hope by doing these little antics and, trying to, have these little conferences and, changing the currency. They're just kind of selling people false hope, and they're kind of just hoping that they get back to where they were at once upon a time.
At the start of the discussion, Eli, you had alluded to the refugee crisis that is generating in Venezuela. I wonder, and this is a question open to anybody, but I wonder if you guys would elaborate a little bit more on what is this crisis about and what is the general effect that it's having on the region?
So with 2.3 million people fleeing, it's not just because, oh, like, I don't like our government anymore. I mean, some of it is for basic necessities that they cannot get in their country. Like one of the biggest ones is their hospitals, that they can't perform surgeries anymore that are life-saving to some people. So they're having to cross the border, maybe into Colombia, maybe into Brazil, to hopefully find a hospital that will do a life-saving surgery on them. And help them. But I mean, also you have to think about those other countries are now facing issues because when other people come in, like I think it was Colombia had to eventually like close their border for a while because there were diseases coming into their country that they didn't have in Colombia, but that people were bringing in, and they were hoping that, you know, people there wouldn't get it too. And then Brazil had sent military up to their northern border to keep Venezuelans from coming in. So, I mean, you've got to find that good balance between being willing to help people, but also making sure, like, hey, like, if you're really sick, like, even if they're going to accept them, like, maybe keeping them in a certain area as to not get other people sick and worsening what's happening.
And I think also with all of the people fleeing, 2.3 million or however many it is, you also have to think about who that leaves behind, because at this point, anyone who can get away or had the resources or the means to get away did get away. So the people who are left are sort of just outsiders. So how do you rebuild an economy with, you know, the people that you do have left who may not be the best educated or who may not have had, I mean, not that many people in Venezuela have money now, but who may not have had money to begin with or had a strong job market. So now you're creating with sort of what's left over.
Yeah, I mean, I think other countries were, I think like Eli said, like other countries were even threatening military action about people coming in. Like there was, sorry, I have it right here, 600,000 people that went into Colombia. And I mean, like, so now they're saturating the countries around them. And it's kind of like a refugee crisis anywhere. Like people have that argument, are you bringing your best people? Are you bringing anything valuable here? And I mean, a lot of them have fled to Spain too, and these countries don't really want to take them in because of the same arguments against refugees everywhere. But then I've also seen that, like Oksana said, the rich people are able to get away, but now you just have people who don't really have much of anything, and they have no way to build anything.
I think to one of the points that JD made earlier, you know, early on in the crisis, those people who had cash and could export cash out of the country sent it to foreign countries. So if you have money in foreign accounts because you're a trader or a business person or an investor, it's relatively easy to go to another country. But if you don't have those resources, if you have no friends or family, you really have no place to go. Now, the thing that strikes me about this conversation is it sounds an awful lot like the same sorts of arguments that we're hearing from the Trump administration or American conservatives when discussing immigrants from Mexico. Do you feel that the countries in Latin America are equally justified in trying to stop migration to their country as the United States? More justified, less justified? How do you compare these situations? Are they comparable?
I think, oh my goodness, like Colombia is not a very massive country in comparison to the United States. So like the saturation of people from Venezuela being there, I can kind of understand their argument, because their arguments against people coming in, because I don't think that they can support that many people. I mean, they're not a super wealthy nation to begin with. Whereas like I think it has some of the same basics, but I don't think that it's the same as Mexicans coming to the United States. Like we have such a larger population, and I mean, the agriculture field in America right now, I've heard, for like fruits and stuff like that, is suffering because not enough laborers can get in. And so I don't think it's the same thing, because I'm not sure that Colombia has like the room for physically can support all of those people. Whereas I think the United States could support much more immigration than we allow.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I think one of the biggest differences in the situation is that when I said earlier, like Colombia may have to stop people because they're bringing in diseases or something. And that's like, they're not saying like, oh, we don't want you here. Like, they're saying like, hold on, like we need to figure out a better process to make sure like diseases aren't coming in that can hurt people. Whereas in the United States, they're like, you're coming to steal our jobs. And that's not even factually based or anything. It's literally just based on people's like nationalistic feelings. So I really don't think like they're comparable situations necessarily.
One country has valid arguments and one has racism.
Right. That's what it boils down to. One country is trying to make an excuse that, or one country's making an excuse that, hey, we want to help, but we want to do this, smartly. We don't want people that are already here to be affected by people who are coming over. And like Oksana said, other people are making arguments, hey, they let these people over here, they're taking our jobs. And just coming up with outrageous things to say, just to keep the refugees out.
Well, one of the things that I just checked here a second ago, you said that there were approximately 600,000 refugees, or did you say 60,000 refugees into Colombia?
I said 600,000. That's what it is on this infographic right here.
So that's 600,000 compared to a population of about 50 million. So I guess roughly the equivalent for the American population would be about 35 million. A little over 10% of the country's population arriving would put about 35 million for us. So given that, do you feel that given America's historical relationship with the region, given the size of the problem and the poverty in the region, do you feel that America should be doing more to try to alleviate the problem? Should we be trying to bolster the Maduro government? Should we be doing more to try to alleviate the humanitarian problems? Or is this a Latin American or a South American problem? And at some point, America just has to start letting people deal with their own issues.
I think we need to start letting people deal with their own issues. Because, I mean, literally that's what got us in trouble with the Bush administration. We started dipping into other people's, backyard and literally were in war for almost 10 years and lost, people lost their lives. Because anytime you try to help someone, you're always going to try to put your values or ethics on top of them. And sometimes it can seem a little forceful. And that's when you get a little pushback from these countries coming. Because, America sometimes doesn't have a nice way of trying to help people. They kind of just try to put the iron hand on top of it and be like, hey, we're going to help, but you're going to do this, and this is how it's going to be done. Then that's when you start to get the little pushback of, hey, we want your help, but at the same time, don't try to overtake our country.
I personally feel that with what America has done historically in South America and other areas, I don't think it's fair for us to say hands off now, but when you had something we wanted, hands are all in. Like, I think we have to police ourselves. And I do think, obviously, there's not a way that you can, I don't think that there's a way where you can just say that you have to let everybody in and things like that. But I think, goodness gracious, I just think that when it comes to the humanitarian issues, that it's not really fair for us to take in such a small amount of people, knowing that these crises we've caused so many, and if there's something we can do, we should be able to help. If we're gonna get our hands in everything, we might as well do something helpful.
I mean, just today, Nikki Haley at the UN hosted some event because she's the president of the Security Council this month, and made a meeting specifically about government corruption and used Venezuela as her biggest example. And I don't know how many people have heard this on the news, but I think it was yesterday or maybe the day before that it was reported that something leaked about the U.S. had a plan to kill Maduro in Venezuela to get rid of him, but they didn't end up following through with it. And so you see there's a big contrast there between addressing an issue at the United Nations and making it about corruption and then including Venezuela as an example, versus somebody is literally from the White House is talking to somebody about killing their president. And so obviously the U.S., when they are talking about their involvement in this issue, has some miscommunication issues and needs to decide what role the U.S. is going to play, if any, in this. But like they were talking about, like the whole imperialist history, like honestly, I think addressing it with international bodies and with other groups is probably the best solution at this point, as part of like international organizations. And maybe even instead of being directly involved in Venezuela, maybe aiding the Colombian government in their helping with the refugees, or Brazil, and maybe working with like groups like the Red Cross to make sure diseases and stuff like that down there are being cured, and just the more humanitarian side of things versus the political side of things.
I agree with Eli. I think that we're definitely going to have to come at it from a humanitarian point of view, as far as helping the people and not helping the government, because it's sort of hard to help a corrupt government. And like, we could give them, you know, money and resources through the government, but who's to say that they're actually going to go to the people? And also, I don't think that the Venezuelan government is too keen on America and America coming to help them, especially not after they find out that, you know, America had a plan to kill him. And I also think that in order for it to look like we're trying to help and not to Americanize, like Eli said, we're going to have to come at it from a united front. But I think there's just a strong balance between, there has to be a strong balance between helping the people and not getting, you know, too involved with a government that's so corrupt.
So if I take collectively everything that you guys have said tonight, we have a messed up political system. We have a messed up economic system. We have the people who could help domestically have already left, that the countries in the region are already overwhelmed, that the American government has no real way of dealing with the crisis, and even if they did, we might not even be trusted. Somebody tell me something good about how there is hope for this country. In your own, we're almost out of time, but just go around the table and we'll start with you, JD. Is there any hope, or are there any solutions that are being proposed for how we might be able to deal with this crisis?
Well, I think one of the main things that, you know, they keep their finger crossed and hope that the oil prices go back up. Literally, I mean, I really don't see any other solution or way to help, because literally they put all their marbles inside of one export or import, and now they have nothing to show for it. So their best bet is to, you know, as I would say, keep their fingers crossed and hope that something breaks with the oil prices, and that they could make, you know, half of the money that they made when Chavez was in reign.
Ms. Marquez, any final thoughts, hopes for the future?
I think under the current government regime, whichever you call it, all that there really is to do is hope that the oil prices pick back up. And that's really sad to say. But also, I mean, at every point, a regime has to die off, and like to come together and, you know, just have other countries rally behind them and picking a less corrupt government the next one.
Mr. Wood, do you agree that the best hope for their future is for Americans to pay $4 a gallon for gasoline?
I'm taking the more political reform side than economic reform side, just because I feel like it ultimately, you have to have government reform first before that economic reform can even happen. And so what that's going to take is they're going to have to make sure that there's checks and balances system that has been taken away because of that new legislative body that Maduro formed a few years ago that gave him like all the power, and their Supreme Court. I think honestly that's what it's going to come down to, is first government reform to make sure there's a balance of power and the people get more of a say in their government before the economy can ever be fixed.
Ms. Wolf, final thoughts?
I kind of agree with what everyone said. I really think, especially with Eli, I don't think that there's unfortunately much hope until the people are able to mobilize and institute a government that they feel suits them better. But like we touched on earlier, I think most of the people left, they're just in a really bad spot, and I don't know what it's going to take, but it's going to take a miracle at this point.
And with taking a miracle, I think that we're just about out of time for this broadcast. I want to thank everybody who has sat through it for joining us for this one. If you haven't already, go ahead and please check out our podcast from our previous session on the opioid epidemic in Kentucky. And also check out our upcoming broadcast, which will be broadcasting next week on the effects of immigration on the American economy, a pretty timely transition, considering the role that migration and immigration have played in the current discussions over Venezuela. So again, thank you very much. This is Sean Williams, this is the lead professor at Campbellsville University, and I hope to see you again next time. Thank you.